All right, folks, it is Friday, and we're all quarantined. We're stuck inside. There's nothing to do, no place to go. So why not talk Christian apologetics? Um, this would ordinarily, under better circumstances, be the night where our local atheist Christian book club would be getting together and talking about Frank Turek's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, or more specifically, Frank Turek, Norman Geisler. We were going to have Frank Turek in person. We were going to have the opportunity to question him and find out a little bit more about his process in writing this book and kind of what he was getting at with some of the points he's making. But unfortunately, we did not get that chance. So a couple of us got together to talk about it here live for you tonight. You got myself, Chris, Jim from Atheist Edge, Jim Majors from Atheist Republic, and hopefully maybe some secret special guests later. We'll have to see who pops in, but thank you for joining us. You have a wide variety of YouTube to watch right now, and we're grateful that you're choosing us for your Friday night viewing pleasure. So let's start talking book.
I just want to clarify something real quick. I'm no longer with Atheist Republic.
Oh,
I resigned almost a year ago today.
Oh, I am super outdated on the latest
No worries,
ongoing things
no
in
worries
the
at
atheist
all.
community. I'm also no longer with Atheist Edge. I died and was resurrected 2 years ago, and then I went on a 3 year ministry, after which I was killed again. And
Praise be to God.
hallelujah. But then I stopped believing in myself, and I'm now an atheist. So, but what are you going to do, right?
Preach it.
Yeah, it's just the way it goes. But so where do we start with a book like this? How about the title? That's just one of those things. I don't like snarky apologetics, even when they're pretending to not be snarky. And this is one of those ones that kind of gets to me for a couple reasons. One is that once again, apologists are equivocating about faith. And I feel like we keep having to have this conversation about what faith is, and when when atheists use it, what does it mean? Or when believers use it, what does it mean? And it's always different things. And and yet here we have the, I don't know who came up with this title, if it was the publisher or one of the authors, but here we have once again an equivocation on the terminology of faith. And it's weird because I've seen kind of a increase in apologists who are using the faith equals confidence angle, which is fine. I'll let him use that. It's kind of weird to me personally, but it's one way of looking at it, but that's not the way. That's explicitly not the way Turek uses it in his book. He's very specifically going on a faith equals something extra. He says this specifically towards the intro of the book. He says, "We mean that the less evidence you have for your position, the more faith you need to believe it, and vice versa. Faith covers a gap in knowledge." And it turns out that many atheists have even bigger gaps in knowledge because they have far less evidence for their beliefs. So he's not even doing the new coolness where he's just where he's using confidence and faith interchangeably. He's pretty explicitly using it in terms of blind faith, and he's basically saying that's okay because atheists do that too. Um, so Jim, I don't know how you guys feel about this. If you prefer apologists to use the faith equals confidence equivocation, or if you'd rather them be honest when they're talking about it being blind faith.
I, I'm fine with it as long as they're upfront with it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it can lead to a problematic discussion if you don't
Sure.
figure out the definition beforehand.
Like, I think last time Dr. Turk came to our book club in studio when we did the book, what was his book, Stealing from God.
Right.
I think he mentioned, I think it was me that asked him, um, what's with the title? It's the exact same, just basically paraphrased what you just said. And his response was, well, it first off, the title of a book is intent. It's like a YouTube video. Sometimes it rides that clickbait little fine line,
Mm-hmm.
to get people to buy it. He admitted that the context by which faith in the title it's true enough. It's the old style faith. It's the leap of faith, but it's for the title. It's to get people to come and read the book, to buy the book, and he held true to the newer version of what everyone considers faith to be based on evidence nowadays. And I still contend, even though, go back and look in our library, Atheist Edge, I did an awesome interview with Dr. Brady Blevins, and he broke down why why the word faith means confidence, has always meant confidence and trust, and it's never meant this blind faith. So that was a great video, and I don't know where I just went with that, but yeah, I think that's what his intention was originally.
There's one way to look at the title from a certain perspective and say that it's very ironic coming from a Christian titling the book that, because there are so many people, myself included, who are led to atheism precisely because they don't have enough faith. And let's see, what was the other point I was going to make? Shoot. Anyways.
Yeah, it's all good. It's Jim. I don't remember the exact part of the conversation from last time, but if he's trying to use the faith equals confidence aspect, like when he was talking to us, he doesn't seem to use it that way in the book, because he's constantly chastising atheists for being presumptuous in saying that there's no God, or disbelieving in God, however you want to put it. Now, he would say, side point, he would say that atheists know there's a God and deny him. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But
it also seems like an argument from incredulity as well, though. That he cannot possibly imagine how atheism or how the statement that no gods exist could be true, therefore it's got to be false, or that he can't imagine how God existing could be false, therefore it must be true.
Yeah, there's a whole lot in this book that is wrapped up in that is arguments from incredulity or arguments from ignorance, but kind of wrapped up a little differently.
Right.
He's insisting that he has evidence for his positions.
It's wrapped in rhetoric.
Yes, he's saying that he's making a positive case for God, but when you get down to it, a lot of it is pointing out what we don't know about the universe, and
Right.
it hinges on the fuzziness at the fringes of bleeding edge science.
Right.
And
Essentially, God of the gaps argument.
yeah, and it's almost even worse than that. Let me tell you what kind of house of cards he's building with this book. And so the structure of the book is kind of, he's trying to make a cumulative case, starting from truth exists on down to the Christian God is real, Jesus rose from the dead for your sins, and the Bible's true, and all that specific stuff. But he starts with a very modest premise. And he moves very quickly from truth exists to God, a theistic God exists. And
Right.
he does this through the Kalam, cosmological argument. And his defense of the Kalam is incredibly spotty. It, he presumes that we know for a fact there was nothing before the Big Bang, which is not a given that I don't believe it's settled scientifically at all. Like as far back as we can detect or model right now, there has been stuff.
Right.
We haven't set up anything where nothing has existed or can existed.
Yeah, in all the arguments that I read in his book, it seemed like he was essentially getting at, not saying it, but you can definitely sense it, that it's easier to believe that God created the universe and everything in it, and that God does exist, than it is for him to believe in the non-existence of God, and actually, you know, and actually be able to be okay with having these gaps in knowledge.
Yeah, it's weird. He at times he's okay with gaps of knowledge when it comes to the life of Christ, for example. But he's not okay with it when it comes to science. And I'm trying to find
Right.
some of this exact stuff.
But he lures you in, though. He lures you in with like these exact and precise measurements of like um, uh, matter and velocity and the speed of light and gravity and so on and so forth. Like he really hits you with these scientific things and kind of reels you in, and then slowly goes pseudo on you.
Yeah, it's subtle, and it's not just he lures you in with the science sounding numbers. There's certain arguments that he has that rely on common sense more than they probably should. Like when he's talking about causality, and he bases it on, it's not like a scientific principle, as the way he puts it. He says, hey, we've all observed that things don't happen without a cause,
Yeah.
and as the vast majority of the things that we experience every day, you can attribute to causes, and you can make chains of causes, and you can make them go back and back and back. But then we get to the start of the universe, and that's where things get tricky, and we don't necessarily know if the laws of physics as we know them apply then. That's why it's
Right.
so problematic for him to make his cause based on this. And here's why that's a problem, because he's not going to just use the kalam to just to make the case that there's a God. He's going to connect the kalam
To
directly
causality.
to the, not just causality, he's going to connect it directly to the resurrection of Christ.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because this is his top down argument. He starts with, okay, you have supernatural creation of the universe. He takes that and he gives his case for it and assumes it's settled and moves on. Now, if you can have a God that can create the universe, what's a little water into wine? Or what's a little extra loaves and fishes? Well, what's a little resurrection to the
Yeah.
God that can create the universe.
Yeah,
So
well, what's a little literary device and pass it off as a historical?
yeah, it's so this is his cadence. He goes kalam, supernatural causation is possible, to miracles are possible, to resurrection is possible, and then he kind of is
It
like,
it's so ironic that he uses the word causality, and just like with it being the exception, apparently it still applies.
yeah,
Chris,
it's
can I jump in real quick? Sorry. Chris, I hate to do this to you, but in the live chat, it went from like 20 live viewers to like 2, and they're saying that we've been buffering like for the last 11 minutes, so they're not
Oh,
seeing
shoot.
us. They're just stuck on your face. So we got 2 options. You can start the live stream completely over, and I'll send out the invites again. Is that John? Yes. Oh, you're muted.
John Ferrer, yes.
There you go. Yes, sir. Okay. So I'll send you the invite link. Do you if you want to start over, Chris, or if you just want to keep going? This is being recorded, correct?
Yeah, I'm recording this so we can just keep going. Yeah, I'm not sure. I've not had this issue
Yeah.
before, so
Okay. Maybe it will just rectify itself in the live chat. If not, we'll put this back out as a pre-recorded. We can just keep going probably.
yeah. Okay, so technological failure, whatever.
I'll let you know if it comes back up though.
Yeah, I can see on my thing it says reconnecting, but
And remember, I got 10 little items. Once we get to, let me say real quick, the first couple of chapters, all the chapters deal with evolution. You can go ahead and just discard those right off the bat, because there's plenty of believers that accept natural selection, rightly so. B, it has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not Jesus rose from the dead or not, and it has nothing to do with being an atheist. Accepting evolution, even though all of us do, has nothing to do in and of itself with being an atheist. So those chapters are gone. So once you get to chapters 7, 11, and 12, I have some things to add and some questions for. We got a believer in here now, so I'll bounce it off of him.
okay. Which chapters were 7, 10, 11 were the topics of those?
Oh, 7 dealt with it's he compared prescriptive laws to descriptive laws, but he conflated the two, like legislation versus natural laws. So I have some things with that. Chapter 11 was the criterion of embarrassment, basically, and 12 is the not historicity of Jesus, but the legitimacy of the resurrection narrative.
Yeah, he does this kind of.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, he does this kind of thing, kind of through the book, and he reminded me when we were talking about criterion of embarrassment, where he thinks he knows what's going on inside of people's heads, and he gives certain benefits of the doubt to people that are on his side that he doesn't give to people who are not on his side. Like he said when we had him at our book club last time, and he says it again in this book. He brings out the old chestnut that atheists know that there's a God. They just deny him because they want to keep sinning. Which, I've been hanging around the atheist community for a few years now, and that applies to exactly 0 atheists that I'm aware of. It's I guess a handy side benefit, not to worry about certain things anymore. But I did not go on a spree of debauchery when I became an atheist. I just kept reading books because I'm apparently too lame to fit into the stereotype being presented here. And he also says that about Darwinists specifically. Like he connects it, we're talking about evolution, he connects it to Darwin, saying that Darwinists see that their evidence is flawed. They see the irreducible complexity or what have you, and they bury it because A, they want to keep sinning, and B, because they want to be able to keep making money as evolutionary scientists.
Or because we hate God.
I don't think he says that specifically. That's not exactly a stretch, though, from what he does say. He says plenty. And I found it kind of weirdly ironic that he's talking about, okay, the Darwinist scientists are suppressing evidence because they want to keep making money, coming from a professional apologist and speaker and writer.
He made a few points that made it seem like to me that he was kind of accusing atheists of making it personal with God.
I don't remember. I'm trying to make sure that I'm not. I've definitely heard people say that a lot. I'm trying to remember if it's in this book specifically. It very well might be. I'm just trying to make sure I'm not putting stuff on him.
I'll be honest with you. I haven't read it in a little over a year. I just skimmed through the footnotes before the video.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's cool. Oh, man. So, anyway, but talking about gay inside people's heads. So, he's He's saying that he knows all these things about atheists, right? But when it comes to the gospel writers and the apostles, he's willing to give them all the credit in the world for possible issues that come up. Part of that is stuff like the criterion of embarrassment, where and this is not just Turek and Geisler who say this. This is a pretty regular.
Right.
This comes up pretty regularly coming up with the gospel. So okay, why would they include all these embarrassing stories about the lack of faith of the disciples and Peter running away and denying Jesus? Why would they have women come and visit the tomb first when women were not considered valid witnesses when it comes to testimony and stuff like that? And I think
In
there's
court.
yeah, and it's assuming that they're including these things for specific reasons,
Right,
but
but there's a lot of implications there, though, because if you look into some very very early texts, apocryphal though they may be, we have like infant accounts of Jesus killing other children and bringing them back to life. I would say that's a criterion of embarrassment, but it seems like he puts way too much authority into just the criterion of embarrassment, and when that arises in something that he supports, then he wants to give it full authority.
yeah, it's not the criterion of embarrassment only applies if you can't come up with a non-embarrassing reason or a reason why you would write embarrassment
Right.
into a story.
But it
And
can't stand on its own, like as a mark of historicity. If that's the only thing pointing to historicity, that cannot in itself point to it definitively.
yeah, it's not a bad pointer, like in a vacuum, but it doesn't really stand on its own. Like for example, if the I never understood the women of the tomb objection, and Turek and Geisler bring it up. I'm pretty sure William Lane Craig has brought it up, and it's all over the Gospels where Jesus is appealing to the lesser in society.
Right.
Like, I mean, it might sound super convincing if you had, I don't know, Pharisees showing up at the tomb or temple leaders showing up at the tomb, but that's not who Jesus is ministering to. He's ministering to the poor and unfortunate. He's talking to the tax collectors and the Samaritans and the women caught in adultery. Uh, so it's very fitting narratively to have the women show up at the tomb because these are the people who would be probably most interested in Jesus still at that
Right,
point.
but do you remember why they were going to the tomb and what they had with them?
Well, they're going to embalm him, right? That's the other
Right.
part.
Well,
They're
yeah,
doing the
they brought
rituals.
the spices, even though in John it says that Nicodemus brought 100 pounds of it to embalm him, and that Mary witnessed them placing Jesus into the tomb, so she already knew that this had happened. And not only that, but I believe it's in Mark, it may be Matthew, but I'm pretty sure that it's Mark. With women are on the way to the tomb, and they make a statement something along the lines of, "Oh, geez, who's going to move that big stone for us?" And then you have the varying accounts at the tomb itself.
Yeah, and I mean, this has all come up before. I'll throw this out there too. Like my personal, I when it comes to like liar, legend, lord stuff, which comes up in this book, is actually another one of those big focal points that other stuff builds off of. When it comes to stuff like that, uh, I'm not. I'm fine with saying okay, Jesus was real. I just think his story grew in embellishment over the years.
Like anybody else.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the craziest thing in the world. But
Right.
the Turek and Geisler, they don't like that, and they're putting out two possibilities here, saying okay, they could have exaggerated, but or they may have been inspired to be even more meticulous because of the importance of their message. He says they don't want to lose credibility and cause their message to lose acceptance.
Right.
Which maybe, or maybe they the story grew in the telling, just like happens constantly. You know, we can't go back and tell exactly what happened, but he's given them a huge benefit of the doubt and saying, "Oh no, they weren't exaggerators. Actually, they were super duper careful, so you can definitely trust what they have to say." And I don't think he would say that about any atheist authors. Like if we had an account from, say, Pilate, or attributed to Pilate, that was like, oh yeah, we threw that. There was this guy Jesus who was causing trouble, so we crucified him and threw him in a mass grave, and we
Right.
made sure no one could recover it. Then he would say, well, of course they would say that. It would be super embarrassing to them to have Jesus up and walking around. And actually, there's a section where he's talking about the Old Testament, and he notes that, well, he's talking about the Exodus, and he's taking issue with the people who note that, you know, Egyptians never say anything about Hebrews. They never say anything about a mass slave uprising and leaving. And he's like, well, of course they wouldn't say that. You know, they wouldn't want to record such a massive national failure on their end. And
Right.
I'm like, oh, okay, apply that to the disciples, apply that to the early Christian writers, and say, okay, oh no, he didn't die. He totally rose from the dead, and we all saw him, didn't we, guys? Oh yeah, we totally saw him.
But when they want extra biblical evidence, who do they go to?
They go to all the Roman writers and Tacitus and
Well,
Josephus
and wait, right? I was going to say, and one Jewish, Josephus, but in the late first century to the possibly very very early second century, you've got Tacitus, you've got Josephus, and Suetonius. Tacitus and Suetonius both being Roman historians, and Josephus being a Jewish historian. Now, they will say that because they recorded accounts of Jesus, that therefore it's real and it's historical. But the problem is that all three of these historians that wrote about Jesus weren't even born until years after the crucifixion, but they were living during the time of Vespasian, and they also record accounts of Vespasian doing what? He heals the blind. He heals the lame. He performs all of these miracles. And Josephus, Tacitus, and Suetonius all give accounts of it in much more embellishing detail than any of them did about Jesus. And I guarantee you they would not accept that as historical fact, even though you have three contemporary historical sources.
Yeah, it raises questions about certain other points that are made in the book. You know, they always pull the other historical details where, okay, they knew these locations, they knew these customs, they knew these rituals. They provided accurate supporting details about the life at the time, so we can trust them when it comes to miracles and resurrections and stuff like that.
But this is a miracle.
Right.
The healing of the man's blindness by spitting on his fingers and rubbing on his eyes and cheek.
Right, but of course they don't believe that because it's not their particular person.
They're contemporary historians.
I know.
Yeah, I gotta play it up a little bit.
We got Jim hand raised very politely.
Okay.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
used to
sorry.
large groups. I always raise my hand because it's, you know how it can get when you get like 6 or more in a group. Oh gosh, everyone's talking on each other. Let's try this, Chris. There are still people in the live chat waiting for it to unbuffer. I am 99% sure if you leave, this chat doesn't go away. So do you want to leave and come back? Because you're hosting this show. If you leave and come back, it might fix itself. And in the meantime, John, we can bounce our ideas off John. He hasn't even spoken yet. Let's hear his take on everything we've said up till now.
Well, I can leave the hangout, but
Yes.
then they won't be broadcasting anything.
And when you come back, when you come back, it would be a new
It would
broadcast.
be a new broadcast. So,
Because you're going through StreamYard.
right, yeah, I'm using a bypass.
Okay,
So
let's keep plugging away. I'll tell everyone in the live chat just to
yeah, I'm wondering. I don't know if it is a bandwidth thing with everyone being on because of quarantine, or if it's just the new system you're using. Because I was able to
no, this
broadcast a
is
couple weeks ago just fine.
no, this has happened before to us, even with a good broadband connection. This just happens from time to time, and sometimes if the host, because I've never gone through a separate layer of like you are right now. You got Google Hangouts and StreamYard. We've just been through one layer, and if the host leaves, the stream keeps going, and they just come back and it fixes itself. So I don't. Okay, so yeah, we'll just keep going. I'll tell everyone in the chat, just if you want to stick around, that's fine. If not, we'll just put this out later as a pre-recorded on our channel.
Sorry,
As long as you're
world.
100% sure that it's being recorded completely and correctly.
Well, I was 100% sure we were broadcasting live, so
Yeah, okay. I mean, we are broadcasting live, but it's just a buffered still shot of you.
We could
Oh,
just
well,
be
that's the most
having a
important
great
part.
conversation that nobody will ever remember.
if no one sees it, then it's not worth it.
All right, we can keep plugging along. I'd like to hear John's take on everything we've
Yes, counterpoints,
said up till
But
now.
please.
we're just trees falling in the woods.
I'm just listening in, trying to pick where I could drop in. I did have one point regarding regarding science profs doing it for the money. I've tried to find gainful employment in academia, and it's hard to make it in there. It might be very different for folks with STEM degrees, as those are more practical than my philosophy degree. But suspending that concern, there's a practical awareness of the culture and the expectations, and you might say political party lines. And when it comes to the sciences, there's a disproportionate, I'll just say bias, not necessarily a bad negative bias, but just a bias in favor of naturalistic evolutionary accounts for everything from biology to chemistry to cosmology. Trying to stretch it beyond its original limits to say, is there a naturalistic account for all of these things? And if a person were to try to publish on intelligent design and they had a full-time position at, say, UCLA, there's a good chance they're going to get blackballed and run out within the year. You have to be tenured if you're going to if you expect to be able to maintain your job. So it's not about making big bucks. It's about keeping your job, which is a practical concern because it's been well documented that colleges in the humanities departments are disproportionately left-wing and have a higher ratio, not like 95% ratio of atheists, but more like 60, 70% or 40, 50%, as opposed to the general public, which is going to be more like maybe 5 to 10%. You're going to have a higher ratio of those worldviews represented in the humanities departments and in the sciences. Now, it changes when you get over to like economics and engineering and some of the more abstract sciences. So like particle physics, particle physicists are less likely to have the same ratios of politically left-wing and or naturalistic and atheistic commitments. So it's just one of those things where I'm not making a big claim about that's the way it is, that's the way it should or shouldn't be. I'm just saying that's just kind of what a lot of the stats bear out. And so it's a liability if a person were to say, yeah, I kind of think the Darwinian mechanism is inadequate. Well, you can really get run out of the system for that. Just like you could, I think it was a UT Austin professor who tried to publish the most extensive review on, and this is off topic, but I think it parallels what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. He tried to publish on children who were raised by homosexual parents, so same-sex households. And his publication he drew conclusions that these children tended to have statistically significant increases in, mental disorders, dropout rates, things like that. And even though he was very rigorous in his methodology, the Regnerus study, that's it. Regnerus is his last name. He had to wait till he was tenured before he could manage to publish that, because it did not fit the preferred conclusions that you're allowed to publish. We tend to think of the sciences as, dispassionate. It's not. It should be, and some folks are better at it than others, but there's a lot of sociology involved that we have to be realistic about if we're going to try to, apply for a research grant in a science department.
I'm in a PhD program for biblical studies, and I currently run the risk I'd rather not say, because I run the risk of being dismissed from the program, and I had to really toe the line with what I write because of a sort of an oath that you have to take and sign upon admission. And I'm an atheist, and that's in direct violation of that oath. I'll put it that way.
Were you an atheist at the time when you signed up, or is this something that happened, say, a year or two into the program?
I went through seminary as a Christian, and in between then and now, I became an atheist.
Okay.
And I've got 2 more semesters to go, and I'm just trying to not step on any toes, but it really is hard when it comes to writing things, and especially dissertation, without just really pissing somebody off. And
you have to pick your
I've
battles.
seen people get dismissed for less.
Yeah, you have to pick your battles. So you can appreciate that there's a lot of power plays. There's a lot of
there's a lot of politics.
Politics, and it's going to be like you're going to have at a lot of your seminaries, you're going to have a biblical Christian bias, which is to be expected. It's not a public institution, so they can their house, their rules. But when you get into public institutions, oftentimes there's the same kind of bias and the same kind of politics when it's supposed to be open so that there's no viewpoint discrimination. At least when it comes to non-fringe theories. So I would expect a science department to turn down a job applicant who is a flat earth theorist. I would expect that. And not because I think flat earth has no intelligent people who try to support it, but it's been thoroughly debunked many times over. There's a lot more wiggle room when it comes to things like the origin of life and how life diversified over the years. You've got different kinds of evolutionary theory that have been proposed. You've got Darwinian, right. You've got neo-Darwinian, you've got Lamarckian, you've got historical studies that are still valid consideration today for how people thought it happened before genetics and so on. And so you've got kind of a range of thoughts, not to mention you still have folks that are evolutionists but are critical of the majority paradigm, and they're only willing to support things that they consider to be strongly supported. So they may be agnostic about 90% of the evolutionary account, but they admit that it's largely a faith claim. In their sector, their biochemistry domain, they say, well, I think this is plausible and this is consistent with evolution, so I support it. Don't grant any particular claims in the other 90% of it. And that leaves a lot of room. And that's why you do have legitimate PhD earning professors who still have to duck and hide their intelligent design sympathies, because if they come out and express it, even with the most rigorous defense, because they're not towing the party line, they can get blackballed and run out of the system.
Well, I think that goes with anything that doesn't stand up to the peer review process, and I think that's something that's very different.
And
With,
I think it stands
if you
up
were to
to the
present
peer
that
review
to like a
process.
theological journal
Yeah.
rather than a scientific one.
You're assuming it doesn't stand up to the peer review process. I'm talking about the peer review process can push people out because of politics, regardless of the evidence. And they can say, we grant this other thing without sufficient evidence, but we demand you double the evidence amount to support your view.
Can you give me an
We
example
will
that
let.
it happens outside of like intelligent design claims?
Okay, outside of intelligent design claims, I
Right,
thought
like
I can try to illustrate
like
intelligent design.
outside of just like theological differences.
Uh, theolo- Theological differences about intelligent design. I don't know what you mean. I'm talking about
Well,
intelligent design, not theology.
right. So I'm talking
Are you
about
talking about
them.
creationism?
Right. So I'm talking about them rejecting intelligent design in the peer review process. Uh, but it would be very different if you were to assume that's like a theological journal.
Okay. So let's say you're studying the oh gosh, what's it called? I haven't taught on this. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist book for 5 years now. It's all been on the shelf for me for a while.
I
Um,
thought my 1 year was bad.
the type 3 secretory system, I think, is is the chief objection to irreducible complexity. Michael Behe's theory that you can only reduce these bio machines so much before they're non-functional. And the preliminary objection is alternative use. If you take a mouse trap and you take this part apart, it won't work like a mouse trap, but maybe it'll work like a tie clip. And if you take this other part out, well, it won't work as a mouse trap or a tie clip, but maybe it'll work as a doorstop. And so
That's some hillbilly
alternative,
shit.
alternative. No, this is what critics of. I'm trying to respectfully summarize how critics of Behe say the evolutionary account can resolve the problem without granting his theory. So irreducible complexity. Are you familiar with the theory?
Yes.
Okay. And the chief illustration used for that is the mousetrap. Uh,
It was
and
the bacterial flagellum, which
the
earlier in its evolution was the type 3 secretor. Yes.
and the claim is that earlier in the evolutionary process, you had something that had the parts for the bacterial flagellum, minus a few, but it was functioning for a different purpose. It didn't function like this superb motor that's more efficient than any motor humans have ever come up with. It functioned like a syringe that would inject bubonic plague. And as relative to that life form, it was an efficient use of parts. The problem is that we haven't found any evidence that the bacterial flagellum uh, strictly post dates the type 3 secretory system. If it's going to be a prior part, it needs to come beforehand. But
But by the same
but I'm not
token,
a
we
scientist.
have, the eye has independently evolved at least 15 or 16 times in Earth's history, and so the eye is another commonly used one.
Yeah.
And there are still animals right now with lesser evolutionary versions of the eye, anywhere from a light sensitive cell all the way up to a fully functioning eye.
Let's
Okay.
To assume the order is a faith claim, unless you can demonstrate that this happened before, then you can't say it happened before. If you're going to do hard science, you need a demonstration, not just a theory that this comes after, but we assume that it also came before.
Then the same should apply with intelligent design. That intelligent design should have to demonstrate that it was intelligently designed.
Yeah, I mean, let's
Irreducible
say
complexity is a hypothesis. Hill, sorry,
But,
can you come
but
over
should
here?
it not still be demonstrated?
Hold on. Hold on. This is my wife, Hillary. She's more the science person.
okay.
I was just going to mention that I think a lot of times if you look in the type, I think if it's the same one that I studied, type 3 secretory system, you find them in double membranes instead of single membranes, which would technically be evolutionarily later. So to say that it came before, it usually be single membrane instead of a double membrane. So
That's why I married her.
that would be opposite.
That's
Anyway,
out of my realm.
Yeah.
So I mean, let's get
Yeah,
let's get
I'm not a
down
science
to
guy,
the
so I have to qualify it.
I mean, let's get down to let's fast forward to the end of this argument. Let's say we have no
Well, I was still
clue.
developing my case.
Well, I mean, let's say we had no idea how the flagellum or eye or any equivalent irreducibly complex, whatever you want to propose as being irreducibly complex. Let's say we have no idea how any of that came to be. It just becomes we don't know. All right, it's the ID community has
If we
not.
didn't know, we should claim we don't know. Yeah.
If we don't know, we
Right.
don't know,
If
and I'm fine with that. The ID
Yeah.
community
There's
is
a point I was building to.
Well, and I really don't think there's much value in
that I want to address.
I don't think there's really much value in entertaining either irreducible complexity or intelligent design just because but there's no scientific way to explore them. You know that you can't falsify them.
You're skipping a point that I think is important. To this day, all we know that could have theoretically been a stepping stone to the bacterial flagellum is the type 3 secretory system. It's got at minimum something like 40 parts, and the type 3 secretory system has a few less, but I don't know the exact numbers. I'm not the science person. If you're going to go from micro level changes, gradually developing to get incrementally to the bacterial flagellum, having one stepstone is not proof that you can go from a radically different organism to one that has this type that's distinct. So
Right.
the analogy I give for this is saying we found Hawaii. Hawaii is proof that there's a land bridge between Japan and California, and anything else is faith claim. We have hard evidence that Hawaii exists, and because our prior worldview allows that there's going to be a land bridge between these, then as long as we got Hawaii, then we've disproved your Pacific Ocean theory. Well,
That's a great analogy.
Do you see how having that one bit of evidence doesn't constitute a scientifically credible counter argument if you're going to need at least a sample, at least several different stepping stones before you're going to get there?
Well,
now, the intelligent design hypothesis is not saying we don't know. It's saying we have reason to believe by deep familiarity that this is designed. Now, we are open to any naturalistic accounts so that we can reduce the plausible counterarguments. We invite all the counterargument, but it's impossible to test the fundamental evolutionary concept of unguided change without, in the very same experiment or very same hypothesis, testing the alternative, which is guided change. So every serious evolutionary test is testing both the pro and the con. It's testing the yes and the no for the evolutionary count, and at least leaving the door open potentially. If in science, not everything ends up being some big victory. Sometimes you have very partial claims. Sometimes it's a wash, but you might still be able to publish on it. That's how science works. It's very partial type of incremental type of study. But nonetheless, if you're going to test something for unguided change, you are at the same time testing for guided change.
I want to point out one more thing that a lot of defenders of intelligent design do, and it's regarding specified complexity as opposed to irreducible complexity, where it's like that this is so complex, it can only be created by something. And if you notice, they'll always use an analogy, and in their example, they always make the category error by using something non-biological.
Okay.
That's one thing that I've always noticed with those arguments, is that they always make a category error, and it's not. I don't think it's equivalent.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. They analogize They analogize
Specified
complexity by using non-biological examples. And you find that to be a category error?
Yes, because they compare them to the creation of us. Um,
Okay.
like they'll say, like you find a car, or you find a watch, or you find, it's always something
Yeah.
that you find that has been designed and built by an intelligent mind.
Mhm.
With If you find something, I also want to add, if you find something that looks designed and you know that it's designed and built, you never assume it's by a disembodied mind. I don't know what I
Okay.
know not all Christians believe that, of course, but it seems like the majority today do.
So, in intelligent design, it should be distinguished from creationism in its refusal uh, to make that specific claim that there is a divine creator. Intelligent design has been adamantly, aggressively, and desperately fortified within that scientific domain, so that people know this is not the same thing as poof, God did it, which is what a lot of creationists do, who oftentimes say, "What does the Bible say?" And then let's filter all science by what the Bible says. That's a radically different methodology, and that's why you get very different representatives. So that's one thing to distinguish. My second point, um, and I've gotten a lot of pushback on this with a lot of atheists trying to teach me intelligent design, and I'm like, I don't recognize what you're talking about because you're describing creationism. Intelligent design is more conservative and attempts to put forward more testable hypotheses. There are now journals that address some of this stuff, and there's a lot of publications from people that are tenured professors who are putting forth partial claims of intelligent design, which aren't trying to prove everything. They're just trying to prove, say, you know, bacterial flagellum or genetics or junk DNA, and they're dealing with aspects of it, which is closer to how science operates. We're not
But
trying. We're not philosophers. We're doing science there. We're not
right, but
talking about
there's an
everything in the macro
implication
scale.
there,
We're usually
though.
focusing on.
But there's an implication there in saying that it is indeed intelligently designed, that it
Mhm,
necessitates that there would be an intelligent agent, an intelligent designer.
mhm. Yeah, it
So,
could be humans, could be aliens,
Well,
that
let's not
could be panpsychism.
well let's
We're
not
not talking
forget
about
that
God specifically.
well let's not forget that during Kitzmiller versus Dover, it was revealed that intelligent design textbooks were created
The
by doing a
wedge.
copy or search replace for creationists.
right.
So
Yeah.
even if
The
technically
terminologies
it
hadn't
could
But
distinguished
it
at
could
the
be.
time yet.
But
The
it seems to me
terminology.
that if you're going to make the argument that it is intelligently designed, and then the argument that there's an intelligent designer, then you should then therefore have to demonstrate that there is indeed an intelligent designer, and be able to
Yeah, we there are intelligent designers, you and me. We have
I mean,
familiarity with intelligent design by analogy with our intelligent designs. That's why it's far more familiar to us than the idea of spontaneous design that doesn't have a designer. And we've got, one stepstone from that transition to this. We have billions of examples of intelligent design. So we're much more familiar with that. So we're dealing with something that is much more scientifically credible and
but it's
demonstrable
not
when we
just
say, hey,
that.
let's apply systems engineering to biology and see what happens.
But it's not just that. I mean, it would be nice if we could draw that line there somewhere, but unfortunately, they go to the extent of not only are we designers, but that we everybody cosmologically originated from an intelligent designer.
There's a huge blurry line between and in philosophy of science, it's called the demarcation problem. At what point does science stop and philosophy begin? At what point does science stop and theology begin? At what point does science cease to be itself and start to become pseudoscience? The demarcation problem is a question of how exactly do we define and identify the boundaries of science? And it's an unresolved problem. It's widely granted that we don't have the specific philosophically rigorous outline of what that is. But without surrendering, without throwing out all hope, most of us have at least a working sense of what science is. So that doesn't have to bother many people outside of philosophy of science. However, we do run into a problem when we try to figure out how does science interact with philosophy? How does science interact with theology, if at all? I would suggest that when it comes to identifying any being that is non-natural, science needs to hand off the baton to a field that's appropriately designed for that, such as theology or philosophy. If we run up against the wall and say we can't identify a natural cause sufficient for, say, the origin of life, we've looked at lava jets, we've looked at deep sea vents, we've looked at clays and crystals, and none of them are a plausible account for the origin of life. And
Okay, so
if we rule out all the natural causes, it is plausible to hand that off to a philosopher, theologian, preferably someone who wears both hats, philosophy, theology, and science, to say what explanation gives the best account. But we'll have to then move beyond methodological naturalism if we've ruled out all the natural causes within sight.
But when do you hand it off? Because it's 2020 and we still haven't found a cure for cancer, AIDS, or many other horrible diseases, and yet scientists are still looking for a cure. Are you suggesting that scientists in your model should abandon their pursuit of a cure, and hope that theology can fill in the gaps?
I'm an all of the above kind of guy when it comes to the search for knowledge. I think naturalism is
everything we've ever discovered,
so far as it allows all of the natural causes, all of the naturally known phenomena. There's a lot to be learned there.
All the discoveries ever made.
Supernaturalism doesn't have to stop there and can allow for even the causes of nature.
We haven't made one discovery of the supernatural.
One discovery? Sure we have. We just aren't going to be able to test it with methodological naturalism because, by definition, methodological naturalism doesn't test supernatural entities.
So we've discovered it, but we can't test it or confirm that it's there.
Yeah, the universe. If the universe has a cause, it needs a causer. And therefore, if nature, everything that has conceivably been identified as nature has a beginning, it needs a beginner. And a sufficient cause for nature itself would have to be something that is not nature, but would also have to be sufficient to account for the origin of time, i.e. relativity theory equals mc squared, and the origin of all natural phenomena. And so you'd have to have a timeless, spaceless being sufficiently intelligent to create things as they are. And so that would be a supernatural something, but science can't test that. You're going to have to deal in philosophy to address the transition from part A to part B to the conclusion in the cosmological argument. That's not a strictly scientific argument, it's philosophy. But I'm a big fan of philosophy, so I don't mind handing the baton off to philosophers because we can cover all your sciences and some.
Right, but it's only philosophical or theological in some cases until science does discover it. And there have been many instances, many. In fact, most of the discoveries made were at one time started to have a theological explanation that people were perfectly satisfied with having, and had it not been for the pursuit of science, would never have found the cause.
I think you're broaching a universal psychological phenomenon that is not unique to theologians and religious people, but it's kind of a human thing. We try to cut corners. Our brains. Let's suppose that some degree of evolutionary development is true. I'm not an evolutionist, but let's suppose. Our brains are going to be extremely efficient in saving time and energy for the sake of aiding reproduction, and survival. And sometimes that means we rush to conclusions that aren't true.
Right.
We
Well,
rush
we like the
to,
easy way.
yeah, and sciences have done this too. That's why it took so long for modern science to develop, because
Right.
we had proto science and pseudoscience through all the years that gave just enough of a useful explanation to where you could kind of, help prop people's life along using alchemy and the four humors view of human of human health, uh, ether, stuff like that. So people were trying to come up with stuff, and I think there's a kernel of modern science at work there, because people are trying to understand creation. They're running little experiments here and there, but it hadn't reached the level of rigor that we know of as modern science. And so
Right.
modern science itself took a while to develop, in part because we're economical when it comes to identifying theories. We oftentimes are pragmatists.
But
Now, I would suggest that there's a lot of mysteries that we've only verified just how mysterious they are over the years. Um, while science is doing great things, it's a third person exercise. It's not a first person exercise. So it doesn't necessarily address first person experience. It can be pretty weak when it comes to accounting for the nature of artistic experience. We don't really have much account for consciousness when it comes to the sciences, and there's a lot of things that are often used within the sciences, but are more fundamental than science can even broach, like math. That's pre-scientific, and a great deal of your logic and philosophy is pre-scientific, but it applies very very well when used carefully within the sciences.
right, but it's like, for example, during the Black Plague, one doctor is being recorded as having said that the way that the Black Plague spread was, a vapor was released from the eyes of the sick person if you made eye contact with him, and then you were sick. So they had a kind of an idea about what it was to be contagious. They had no idea about germ theory or anything like that,
Mm.
but they could tell that proximity was a problem. You know, that people would run to the mountains to hide, only to get it
Mm.
from animals.
But
But
that was prior to germ theory, so they're still
right,
working that direction. Yeah.
right. But what I'm getting at is that science does not have to be um, beautiful. It does not have to be perfect. Science happens whenever I stub my toe 4 times on a coffee table. I'm either going to move the coffee table or I'm going to step to the side the next time. Maybe fourth, fifth time's a charm. But it's a learning process, and you don't always implement every aspect of the scientific method. But science is just a method of discovery that is not always producing results, and it's not always producing the right results. Often because
I'm a huge
it's
fan of.
not the process isn't
I'm very
followed.
pro science. You're not gonna get any big objections from me when it comes to celebrating the accomplishments of science. Now I see the layout very differently, quite likely, because I think science itself is a gift from the church to the rest of the world. That the coherence and the but I'm not going to go into the whole historical case for it. I think we can rest on some point of agreement that science is very good, and science correctly done.
Yes.
I don't think it's an enemy of the faith, but you would suggest it is an enemy. I think you would suggest it is an enemy to a great deal of the worldview commitments of the faithful. But I don't think it's really an enemy of the faith. I think it's more of an enemy of hyper fundamentalism, not the true faith, so to speak.
How do you mean?
There, I've been to those churches sometimes where a person says you can't trust a scientist because they don't respect the Bible, and they paint it as a strict dichotomy of science versus religion, science versus faith. They don't see the God who is author of the natural world and the natural order as also being the author of the Bible. I understand that God to be author of both, and so I see that as ultimately a sublime harmony. even if they're going to butt heads a lot with wrong conclusions, oftentimes rushing to conclusions for that whole that habit that we have of being too eager to resolve things before they have actually been fixed.
I want to say one more thing, and then I promise I'll stop talking.
No problem. I like hearing your thoughts.
Well, I know, but everybody else, I'm sure, wants to talk.
No, man, keep going. You're
So, I guess in closing, just we both agree that science is important. That science is it provides value to society, regardless of its origins. It's here now. We love it. The internet's great, right? But science done the right way is hard. It's really hard. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes failure, and it's not easy. So I think that sometimes people choose to take the easy way out just because it may not be important to them at the moment. It may not have a whole lot of impact in their life. So until it does have impact or begins to play a bigger part in their life, then they're perfectly happy with just backburnering it for a while. And so I think that science is the hard way, and that a supernatural explanation is more often than not an easy way out.
That's a fair point. I don't see it as unique to the sciences, but it's still a fair point because the progress of science, not necessarily progress, but the development, the changes, the evolution of science itself, it should require a lot of humility of its practitioners, as they're oftentimes dealing with very small, focused type of hypotheses that they have to keep narrowing it down until they have something that's actually testable and rigorous enough to stand up to peer review.
Sure. And then improving upon that afterwards.
Yeah. And so the brassy, aggressive, cocky attitude that's oftentimes matched with the sciences to say, you intelligent designers, you've never read a science book, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, hold on. Oftentimes we're both dealing in our domains that we're trying to study and say this has the markings of design, and that don't have an account for it just yet within intelligent design. Let's take a look at it. Let's study it. That's a fair approach, scientifically speaking. To rush to the conclusion that evolution is the theory that anybody who challenges it at a fundamental level needs to be run out, which is oftentimes what happens, that's anti-scientific. Because science, if it's aimed at truth, has nothing to fear from people who are just trying to refine and clarify that truth. And if the scientific method is allowed to do its job, then it has nothing to fear from opponents.
But am I getting this right, though, that you're suggesting that
even people who are trying to disprove it and help them to verify it, right?
Right, but am I getting this right, that you're suggesting that science should be the prevalent method of discovery, and then using theology and such as a backup?
No.
So you don't think we should go to science first?
I'm not making a claim one way or the other. I'm not trying to go in that direction. I wasn't commenting on that.
No. Yeah. I know. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a prevalence, like if there's or even a preference.
Depends on what you're trying to explain. If you're trying to explain whether your wife is faithful to you, I don't think putting on your lab coat and trying to reduce that relational dynamic into something testable is going to be deemed the most romantic and helpful for your relationship. That's not the best domain. When you're dealing with third-person observational studies of natural phenomena, science is a perfectly fitting way to address it. If you're dealing with something a supernatural claim, it's fine to address natural alternative theories through science, but you have not necessarily addressed the supernatural claim if you're only addressing natural possibilities. Now, you might be able to say, hey, we have so many natural alternatives to explain that we don't think it's necessary to appeal to a supernatural explanation. And that's fine. But if you haven't looked at any other methodology besides methodological naturalism, then you're basically getting what you presumed, which was we're only allowing natural witnesses in this court. We're only allowing natural conclusions in this court. So surprise, surprise, the verdict is only going to be naturalism.
So what if the claim was that there was this this crying statue of Jesus, and that it was a miracle? You're saying that you would go about that supernaturally because it's a supernatural claim?
No, I would go about it the way I described. I think it's fine to address natural causes. I would look for a leak in the roof. I would look to see if they rigged up something in the statue. Has there been tampering? And even, and I think if there's not a lot hanging on it, if it doesn't carry much explanatory power within a using a abductive method of argumentation, that is explanatory power, efficiency, beauty. Like we do deal with that a lot when it comes to explaining things. Even scientists do oftentimes, and only later figure out a way to test out a hypothesis. But they're really won to it by abductive method before they can verify their conclusions. So abductive method might be used to test whatever supernatural hypotheses might be at work there. But it's perfectly fine to look for a leak in the roof, or try to see if the night crew was sprinkling oil on the eyes or something. I mean, there's a lot of simple natural explanations, and frankly, it doesn't really explain a whole lot. So I'm not terribly convinced by those either. I think if you're gonna really, my favorite miracles to point to would be the resurrection and the cosmological argument and the origin of the universe. The resurrection, just because it has a lot of significance if it is indeed a miracle. If it's not a miracle, then all of Christianity boils down to an elaborate ruse. So a lot hangs on it. And that's going to need more historiographical testing and not a strictly scientific. That is scientific in the sense of experimental science. You're going to have to do more historical science, archaeology, and textual studies and things like that. And so methodological naturalism might be undergirding there, but it's not going to be reproducible type science like you have in labs. Not as much, at least.
Right.
If I could jump in here real quick, I know.
Please do. I'm sorry.
While there, Jim, you were saying that there was a question in from one of the fans who was actually stuck with us through our technical difficulties.
She's Terry Gwynn, one of our Atheist and Christian Book Club members.
Am I the only theist here?
Until the end of the night, if this goes well for you, maybe we'll get another person on your team. But
I'm close. I'm telling you, I'm really close.
Okay.
Let's see. It's a long question. I can boil it. I think I can sum it up I can paraphrase this. Basically, John, what's with the virus? Why is it here? Why did God do this? And is it a test of faith? And God, the Christians say God works in mysterious ways as far as the virus is concerned, similar to put your money where your mouth is. Is this a test of faith? Do you have, basically, why is this virus here, and did God create it?
The short answer is, I don't know why it's here, and no, God did not create it. The long answer, if you want it, is that we can identify things that should or shouldn't be only by reference to a standard of what should or shouldn't be. Nature only gives us what is, not what should or shouldn't be. Therefore, naturalism is totally unequipped to tell us that that virus shouldn't be, that there's some wrongness to it. By implication, through the moral argument, we have reason to think that there's some framework of morality that is not strictly reducible to the accidental outcomes of evolution and naturalistic change, but is potentially transcendent, or at least, if not transcendent of the natural realm, at least mysteriously transcendent within human consciousness. That is, somehow human consciousness managed to defy the naturalistic trajectory and create some sort of leverage to be able to reflect upon itself so that we're not strictly reducible to our parts and we're not strictly predetermined by biological deterministic forces. You would need that to at least be able to know right from wrong as opposed to being forced to thinking one way or another, regardless of truth. To be able to know what's actually right or wrong, you need that. But for there to be a right or wrong, such as this virus is natural evil, there's something wrong about it. For there to be a wrong way for nature to operate, then there has to be reference to some standard. And I think that points us back to a God.
Well,
Now,
if
that's
I
a
could read between the
theistic
lines here
account,
for
not a Christian account specifically. Yeah.
well, if I could read between the lines for the question and I didn't see it, I don't know, and I think this might be what Terry was getting at. You know,
I'm going to copy and paste it into our little side
the
chat
little
right
side
here.
chat, okay. I mean, under an entirely naturalistic paradigm, there's nothing inconsistent with a pandemic level virus.
Yeah.
That could certainly be a thing that develops. I think the question would be under a paradigm, a paradigm of a loving, all powerful God. You know, now all of a sudden we have this worldwide crisis. I think I saw that today that the deaths had passed 100,000 worldwide, something like that. And we have a God that is allowing this to run rampant,
Mm-hmm.
and
Well, it's not
he
running rampant, but allowing it. Yeah.
yeah, and he could proof it away. We don't I don't think we know exactly where it came from yet, but when it was just starting out in China,
Mm-hmm.
he could
Came from China.
he could have blinked it out of existence, and it never would have spread. No one would have even missed it. But here we
Mm-hmm.
are. We're in our homes talking on YouTube instead of real life because we don't want to die. Um, and I know this is I feel like even as an atheist, this is one of those topics that comes up over and over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's probably going to keep coming up over and over and over again. It's because it runs, it doesn't seem to make sense, and I don't, and um, I'm obviously I can't hold you to account for God per se because who knows, but I
Mm-hmm.
mean you understand where we could be looking at this as an
Yeah.
inconsistency.
Yeah. Yeah. I recognize that you're not necessarily saying this is an objection you're raising. You're just trying to give a fair account of the question as she was asking it. So whether or not it reflects something that's a dire urge issue for you, that's not what you're claiming. You're just saying there seems to be an inconsistency for people who claim loving God, yet lots of pain,
Right.
lots of suffering. That seems like it doesn't jive. Yeah, yeah, it does seem like it doesn't jive. Um, a follow-up question is um, if the God of the Bible were to exist, should we expect that his overarching ambition for people should be a relatively suffering free existence marked almost entirely by pleasure and no significant pain whatsoever? Should we expect that to be the overarching guiding purpose for the God of the Bible?
Well, I think the God of the Bible, when he says specifically, you can expect suffering.
Yeah.
This isn't going to be an easy life. However, like, okay, our analogy. I'm not a parent, but I have nieces and nephews I
Okay.
love very much, and you know, I know that you know that they're going to go through some stuff. They're going to get scraped knees. They're going to deal with bullies at school.
Mhm.
Um, they'll be hurt in some ways. That doesn't mean if I see them about to get hit by a bus, I'm not going to pull them out of the way because
Yeah.
oh, life is suffering and we can't expect better. And
Mm.
I recognize that making that case, and there could be a question: okay, where's the line? Where's the acceptable level of suffering? Blah blah blah,
Yeah.
and that's legit. But I I think that you know we could you can have suffering, acknowledge that life is going to be hard in some ways, and not
Hmm.
have pandemics. Like
Yeah.
you don't need to have such a grandiose level of suffering, especially when, and I don't know specifically what your view of God is, but
I'm a pretty conservative Orthodox Christian theist, so
okay, are you Calvinist or more
I'm
Arminian?
Calvinian Arminist. I try to annoy both camps.
Okay.
Yeah.
I come from a more traditional Protestant, non-denominational, blah
I
blah
thought I
blah.
smelled some Armanism in there.
Yeah, I try to. I use my Arminian and Hammer deodorant, but
I was Pentecostal.
gotcha. But yeah, I mean, I was raised in a paradigm, and I was a lot of Christians who have a paradigm that God is trying to communicate with us, and He's trying to draw us
Mm,
to Him and wants to
yeah,
become known. Obviously, Calvinists
yeah.
don't care about any of this stuff, but a lot of Christians have this view. So,
I, I'm not saying that, but
right,
many of them
I
may
know.
not. I
I'm
don't
trying to be
know.
careful not to put something on you that's not on you.
Okay,
But I
yeah.
know that there's a viewpoint that God is seeking us out to draw us to Him, and yet here we have a big world event that is going to push people away from God, um,
Mhm.
to on a large scale. It's going to make a lot of
I
people
don't.
ask these
I don't
questions.
grant that. I don't grant that because great suffering has just as much capacity uh, to make people reevaluate their lives and return to sources of comfort. And I'm just thinking like a psychologist here,
Mhm.
not necessarily a theologian. Return to sources of comfort, revert to patterns that meant familiarity, order, hope, and peace in their lives. And people are just as likely to, after 9/11, we had a surge in church attendance because of a great tragedy. When it comes to this stuff, even though we can't meet on a regular basis, there's a lot of people that are having home Bible studies and they're starting to take up homeschooling. And next semester, I wouldn't be surprised if we have a whole bunch of people pulling their kids out of public school and doing private Christian homeschooling at their house because they said, I can do this. Because they spent 3 months doing it.
I, I, I,
So I
I
don't
had an oral
grant that
presentation.
great pain necessarily drives people away from the faith. Some it does, some it doesn't. Sorry, go ahead.
But I mean, but for an all-powerful, all-loving God, though, I mean, we would expect something more than we would expect from like a psychotherapist or like some other means of us humans dealing with
Oh
it. You know,
yeah,
whether going to church or however we would satiate it. We would expect something better than tragedy, especially for
I
the
wasn't
righteous.
answering the problem of evil with a God as counselor paradigm. I was answering his point
Right.
that pain drives people away from God. I don't grant that. Even a counselor should be able to see that's not that's not necessarily the case. It can, and
Sure can.
there are lots of people that like Darwin himself said that I think it was the death of his daughter or his niece or something like that, and the concurrent problem of evil that goes with that. That for him was a major reason for him to not revert to a theistic evolution, but a naturalistic evolutionary account for things. Even though his colleague, I forget the name, um, said we can't account for evolution unless there's a God pulling the strings behind evolution. The theistic evolution went back at least as far as naturalistic evolution went. So some people are driven to non-belief by the problem of evil. And I'm not necessarily faulting them for that. There is a kind of rational coherence if we understand God's overarching purposes for mankind to be pain and not pleasure and not pain. If that is what we think is the defining goal that he has. If he has other goals such as training up civilizations, preparing individuals to be able to rule and reign in heaven, if he's got a heaven up there,
Yes.
if he's trying to get people's attention, there's a lot of different possible causes at work, and it's too simplistic to say, oh, he just wouldn't allow suffering because he's all loving. Well, he is all loving, but parents allow suffering because they love their kids enough to not want them to be spoiled brats.
Yeah, yes, but they are our parents. But if they could create, if we could create our children the way that we wanted to, with, um, whatever characteristics that we wanted, then we could do that. If we wanted to put them inside of a place where they would have all the food that they wanted, then we could do that. We could put a cookie jar in the middle of the room and say, "Don't get a cookie out of this cookie jar." Um, uh, or you'll die, and then allow something to tempt the children that you've just placed there and given them this basic rule, hadn't warned them against anything that would mislead them in the garden, and then that eventually leading to the downfall of mankind, which I would also add is a prescription by God. It's not, he didn't have to. And I don't think that an all loving, all powerful God would ever implement a generational curse such as a sin nature.
Okay. So so you do not grant that God's overarching purpose is to make people happy and protect them from pain. That's not necessarily what theists should expect of God. What do you think
I the only way that you can reconcile it
that we should include in there?
I think the only way that theists can reconcile it is if they look at God not as right or wrong or any other way. Is you have to look at God as not understanding him at all, as God being completely sovereign and his thoughts just being too large for us to conceive, and we should just go with the flow. I think that is the only way that you can reconcile it.
I would grant that to a degree. I recognize that it's very easy to abuse that, God's ways are beyond us. We don't know. That's
sure. It's an easy way out.
That's punting on first down. I don't think many people use that very well. Now, if we're talking about the God of the Bible, and I affirm classical theism, if we're talking about a triomni type God, then we have no great reason to expect to understand all his plans. We should be able to understand at least some of them, but we're talking about an omniscient God. I know a lot about myself, and I know I'm not even close to omniscient. So I would expect him to have plans at work that I don't quite understand. So that's a preliminary caveat here.
But why would you expect to be able to understand any of them?
Any of them? Because he doesn't want to be a complete mystery. He's a personal God. I still believe in the Christian God and not a mystical, esoteric being that's playing hide and seek for eternity, trying not to be caught. That's not.
But I feel like the claim that he wants to be known is a presumption or a presupposition of his nature.
Christian theism. It's a presupposition of Christian theism because we grant that there is a miracle history where God has revealed himself at precise points, many of which are approximated with historically verifiable details, but for the most part can't be proven with the type of degree of certainty that folks today would demand. But nonetheless, the burning bush, the parting of the Red Sea, creation itself, a resurrection, if even some of these happened, then God is revealing himself, which indicates he wants us to see something about him. He's not just doing miracles that tamper with creation. He's doing miracles which, if you follow the Exodus story, for example, he's always telling them, remember what I did for you. Remember what I did for you. He's ushering them into a relationship with him.
Right.
The normal reading of biblical miracle history is that God is not just using miracles to entertain or tamper with creation, but to invite people to come to know him.
Here's a question.
Right, but we're always hearing about this everywhere else, and there are always these extreme events that we don't know anybody that witnessed them. So essentially, in my eyes, God doesn't want to be known. He just wants to be famous. He doesn't want to make himself known to me. He wants to make himself known in a way that he is recorded, in a way that it is given to me, in a way that God, knowing my mind, would know that I'm very uneasy about accepting something like that as coming from an all-powerful, all-loving God that wants me to know him.
All I was claiming was in response to you're saying you said it was an illicit presumption that we would know any of God's plans. And I didn't say that. I just asked you.
I didn't say that. I just asked you why you thought that it would be.
According to a normal reading of biblical miracle history, if that kind of being exists, he wants to be known. But because he is that kind of being, it would be beyond us to know him with the degree of comprehensive understanding that we could predict all of his purposes. That's an unreasonable expectation if we're talking about the God of the Bible. It's
We
an
don't have to know
unreasonable
his
expectation.
So-
purposes to know his existence.
Yeah, here's what I was trying to ask before. If God wants us, if God's trying to get to know us, but we fundamentally just can't know everything about him, or we're working
He's not
off.
trying to get to know us. He's trying to get us to know him. He already
Right.
knows us through and through.
Gotcha.
But yeah,
Thank you for clarifying. If he's trying to get us to know him, and we can't know him perfectly, but we're just, our brains can't handle it. What are we to then make of, like, what are we to make of 100,000 people dying of a virus? What does how does that help us get to know God at all?
so oftentimes I hear people talk about the creation account as if God made it fallen, as if Genesis 3 didn't happen. God made a screw up from the start and forced it that way. And everything that we've seen, including viruses and cancer and stuff like that, that's what God did. That's not a biblical theism that a person's critiquing. That's something else. Just a plain reading of biblical theism, whatever your commitments are about Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 3 talks about some kind of fall in humanity that was a free, wrong decision by mankind. Now, I contend that we all have profound awareness and experience with free will because we deal with it all the time. Now, a lot of people are determinists, a lot of atheists are determinists. I dare them to prove that without stepping on their own toes. I think free will as a concept is incredibly important to have any coherent knowledge of any kind whatsoever. So
I gotta head out, guys. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I had a really good time chatting with everybody.
Sure. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
Yeah, sorry for hogging the mic, guys.
Man,
Talk to y'all.
it's a pleasure to have you on whenever you can.
Oh, no
Love you,
problem.
brother.
Thanks for being here.
Take care.
Thanks, John.
Thank
Bye,
you. But your claim, I still feel like I'm kind of dancing around it. How do we account for, say, 100,000 deaths from that? I would suggest that God has granted us a tremendous amount of free will together with consequences to create great blessing and great harm. We can tremendously bless generations for many years to come, or curse them and harm them. If anybody in the listening audience had a drunk father, they understand how generational burdens can be unloaded on people who are totally innocent. But conversely, generational blessings can be unloaded when you've got a rich uncle who's worked hard, been industrious, saved up millions, and now you've got several generations who are well taken care of financially. If we're going to be upset about the kinds of cursing that people bring on generations and bring on others besides themselves, then we should equally consider it unjust for people to give out all these free blessings that those other people haven't earned. Both of them are undeserved. One's grace, the other is injustice. But nonetheless, it's not strictly about individual merit and demerits. There has to also be this larger scale, the collective or communal guilt and reward that can happen when we cause things. I'll give an example. Suppose Donald Trump calls up Vladimir Putin and says, "You're a poopy pants. I want to go to war with you." And he starts a war with Russia. Is that our fault? Well, yes and no. It's not our fault, like individually. We didn't cause that. That was Donald Trump. But as a representative of our country, he brought on a great deal of pain and consequence because of his free action. Now, that free will, that's a conventional theodicy, vindication or justification of God's actions in light of evil and suffering. That's free will is probably the favorite go-to. I want to apply it in a unique way that was introduced to me by Clay Jones. He says that in heaven, and I don't think the Christian account makes sense ultimately without heaven. I grant that we cannot give a natural account of the pros and cons of all this evil and suffering if we leave out the last chapter of the Bible story. That's critically important to make sense of it. And if we have to make sense of it without it, then all the answers are going to come up short. Just being honest here. Well, Clay Jones says in heaven we have biblical reason to believe that those who go to heaven will rule and reign with Christ, not above him, but underneath him. And that's a high privilege. And he also thinks we're going to have free will in heaven. Free will? Well, I thought heaven's supposed to be perfect. All these free will people aren't going to sin? Yeah. Well, how exactly do you get a large population of people who have the ability to choose evil but never do? Perhaps it would take the kind of lesson that we've been learning from the start of human history till now to learn that sin is stupid. All the vast implications of our sinful, selfish behavior, we see that played out in every creative way possible that we could imagine. And we see that every time we try to do something contrary to God's prescription, we end up with something that's even more destructive than we were trying to avoid. And so I think God's plans are not just to minimize suffering and promote pleasure on earth. I think he's trying to prepare a people that are going to be mature enough to have free will and never abuse it, and will also be so familiar with the kinds of responsibilities that he has in being an authority over civilizations, which we're going to have some degree of ruling authority there too. How do we learn ruling authority? We have to have consequences. If there's not consequences, we don't really learn our lesson. So all of that, I think, is a grand school of hard knocks preparing us for heaven.
Okay, a lot of stuff there.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
No,
I know
that's fine.
it took a long time to get it out there.
Yeah. I've heard, generally speaking, suffering in this life is to prepare us for a reward in the next of some kind. That's one of those unfalsifiable things that, if that's the case, sure. But I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if that's been established.
And if you're aiming at Christian theism, then you should account for it within its own terms, which includes heaven. If you're aiming at theism broadly, then that changes it a little bit.
Man, we've been kind of all over the place. We were talking about a book, weren't we? At some point,
it was a coronavirus
Well,
question.
I do have a way to tie what we're talking about right now to the book, if you will indulge me. My first question is exactly what to just pick up what John was talking about. I don't know if we can agree on this. Well, let me try. Do you think that maybe there are people right now with genetic, clinical, actual medical conditions that prevent them from, quote unquote, being good people or from not sinning? I'm talking specifically about sociopaths, psychopaths, people with hardwired neurological condition where they're just, free will or not, they're prevented from doing good or feeling empathy. And if so, when they get to heaven, does that get rectified somehow, according to your idea? That's
a really interesting question. I have to unpack it a bit because I think there are a few things put together that don't fit. Psychopath would be hardwired. Sociopath would be enculturated into pathology. Slight difference there.
Okay.
A psychopath would be someone who, some chemical imbalance from birth.
And this,
another person might be abused and treated badly till it happens. There's
just for the viewers, this is based on chapter 7 for those of you that are following along. Chapter 7, I don't know who wrote chapter 7, if it was Geisler or Turek, but quote unquote, all people are impressed with a moral sense.
Yes.
And that's when when I was reading it, I was like, hello, psychopaths. No, that can't be.
I think sociopaths have moral knowledge. I don't equate moral knowledge to the empathetic response that distinguishes non-sociopaths and psychopaths from sociopaths and psychopaths. The empathetic response is definitely a great help in cluing us into maybe some of the subtle decisions, subtle choices, like, if I'm trying to get the cat into the house, is it appropriate to kick him? Well, it would hurt the cat. I don't have feelings regarding that, so I'll kick him. But to know that we're trying to get the cat in the house, a person can still be trained and still use rational knowledge to figure out a lot of these things, even if they don't have that empathetic shortcut to recognize what's going to be more empathetically beneficial and what's not. So I think sociopaths and psychopaths still have moral knowledge. They just are less likely to care about it by by their prior conditioning or prior wiring. Now, as it as it happens, I know of a Christian. I don't know if he identifies as a psychopath, sociopath, or what, but somewhere in that ballpark, David Wood is a very experienced apologist who he prioritizes a lot of Islamic apologetics. But he, in his testimony, you can go on YouTube and look up David Wood testimony. You can hear him talk about how he recognizes he had that pathology, but he still knew right from wrong. He just thought he translated in terms of nihilism, thinking that he was the Ubermensch, the overman, who is above the peasant sheep morality of the masses, and he translated it as a strength instead of as a deviance. And he ended up assaulting his father, and I think he had time in prison. But in prison, he came to faith, and later he ended up evangelizing and converting. Gosh, it's not Abdu Murray, um, a Muslim who went to school with him. And so it's entirely possible to have moral knowledge and even to respond to a spiritual invitation to salvation, such as David Wood did, um, despite having a pathology like a sociopath or psychopath.
I'm not saying it's not I'm not saying it's naive to think that every human born is going to spend an eternity in heaven and never once even feel the compulsion to commit a sin. But I just don't know the mechanism that would cause that to happen without taking away our free will. I don't know. Anyway, I don't know if Chris, if you're hosting this, if you want to get into a whole morality thing, but also in chapter 7, my other note was, okay, Turek compares legislative laws with natural laws. The first one, the former being prescriptive. We, as a society, we invented these, we implemented these. Natural laws are descriptive. We didn't invent them, we're just observing them. And he conflates them in the book, and I'm not the only one, because I looked at several critiques of this book from skeptics, non-believers, and what have you, that consider that liken this comparison to a shell game. Would that be accurate? Was it a shell game for the readers of of course, the readers of this book are going to be believers. You know, weirdos like me and Chris are one of the few, or some of the few non-believers that even picked this book up. So he's placating to his base audience. Is he playing a shell game with his people?
Are you asking me or Chris?
You, John. Sorry.
Oh,
does it feel like it's a shell game when he conflates prescriptive and descriptive laws like that?
If he conflates them, it could be. I would like to see what passages led you to believe that. Do you have a page number?
I didn't put that.
Here.
Yeah, I just have chapter 7.
He might have been trying to analogize it in a way that would get, say, a naturalist a step closer to understanding what he's talking about, because no one's really debate. Like, there are atheists who don't believe that moral facts exist, or they believe it's all relative. There are moral nihilists who are atheists, but I don't know of any atheist who thinks that there are no natural laws like gravity. I've never met an atheist who denies that. And so perhaps he could have been trying to analogize moral laws by appeal to descriptive laws in developing his case. But like I said, it's been 5 years since I really picked up this book. I used to teach it, but I never saw him as conflating them through the times I read through the book and taught from it.
Well, this is what he says specifically.
Okay.
Well, he does two different things. He talks about moral laws and he talks about laws of nature.
Okay.
When he's talking about moral laws, he says the fact that a moral standard has been prescribed on the minds of all human beings points to a moral law prescriber. Every prescription
Okay.
has a prescriber. When he's talking about
Mm-hmm.
natural laws, he says natural laws are not immutable because they are descriptions of what happens, not prescriptions of
Mm-hmm.
what must happen. Natural laws
Mm-hmm.
don't really cause anything, they only describe what regularly happens in nature.
Yeah,
And
that's a good distinction.
yeah, I mean, now when it comes to the moral question, my disagreement with him is not so much on the way he uses the word law. It's the way that we've read two books of his now, and the question of morality comes up in both of them. And in both of them, he has a lot to say about the failings of subjective moral systems, or just people's
Mm-hmm.
opinions, they're not enforceable on anyone else, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
In this one, he does the same thing, and he does try to make a case. The case that he makes for his position of objective morality, which he doesn't even try to make in his other book, but this one makes the case that, oh, we just know it. We all have this sense of right and wrong. And I can get behind we have that, we have a sense of right and wrong as things, as people, aside
Okay.
from psychopaths. But we have vast, vast disagreements about what falls into those categories. And I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
what your opinion on the matter is. That I have come to the view that, even that I don't think the existence of objective morality has met its burden of proof, or at least no one that I've
Okay.
talked to has. I would love to have a
No one you've
perfect
talked to? Really? Okay.
I know people who assert it, who claim it,
Oh, okay. I thought you
who
were saying you've never met someone who thinks that
oh no,
objective
I've
morality
met
has been
many people
sufficiently proven.
who say it's a thing, but the case for it is lacking. I
What
don't.
would you consider a sufficient proof? Can you give me like a ballpark sense of what would constitute sufficient proof of that? And because I hear people say it's not been proven, but oftentimes I wonder what uh, demonstration would they consider satisfactory? And many times they haven't even thought about it because I think they've just said, well, it's not been proven. Well, maybe it's not the kind of thing that needs post hoc proof, but it's something that can be known as a properly basic thing. That's how it's asserted in our um, Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, not proven by the scientific method or proven by abductive method, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If those are not things that are objectively true, as opposed to just true on a subjective level, then you would be questioning the validity of human rights as such, and granting just like a civil right that we call human rights, but it's not innate rights by way of our humanity. It's just the dispensation of our civil government that says you're allowed to live because I say so. You
Well,
don't have a right to life. You have the protections that I give you for now because I choose not to withdraw that right yet.
okay, let's see if I can defend my position without seeming totally un-American now that you brought the founding fathers into it. But I mean,
It's
it's
good though.
yeah. But
Yeah.
you'll note that they say, okay, these things are self-evident. That is their defense.
Yes.
We all just know it, and that's very similar to what Turk and Geisler do in this. These things
Mm-hmm.
are moral. Murder is wrong. Lying is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Stealing is wrong. We just know
Yeah.
these things. Um, and you can say that about a lot of stuff. Um, for a long time, it was I know this is a little bit different, but for a long time it was self-evident that the sun revolves around us.
So we're going from a moral law to a
Right, and then this is why
natural
I
observation.
recognize it's not a
Okay.
perfect analogy, but
Okay.
just saying something is self-evident doesn't mean it's actually
Correct.
corresponds with reality.
saying it's self-evident doesn't prove that it's self-evident. But if it is self-evident, we can say it's self-evident. Now, I'm not. Now, let me back up a little bit. I'm not trying to revert to some simplistic, properly basic argument saying you all know this and you're in denial of what you already know. I'm not quite saying that.
Mhm.
I am suggesting that it's possible that there is enough widely recognized knowledge about this that it's at least a plausible prima facie tenet that we can grant that there do exist human rights. Now, that's still subject to falsification. We could try to disprove it, but I don't necessarily grant that we should start saying we don't know it until we prove it after the fact. We take this thing that so many civilizations have considered self-evident, and we consider it unproven and then have to prove it before we can grant it. I think it's still a good prima facie starting point, as evidenced in part by a lot of agreement. I don't think that's the kind of rigorous testing that your typical scientist wants before they go publish something in a peer-reviewed journal. But that's the problem with trying to do ethics like it's a natural science. That's one of the problems. There's many. Ethics, I think Aristotle was correct in saying that we have to treat the field with the same degree of vagueness, approximation as is suited to that field. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he granted that this is an imprecise science he was going into, science in the old sense, not natural science. And so he basically said, expect there to be a lot of blurry lines here. Just expect that, because that's what we're doing here. This is ethics. This isn't, logic. Logic, you got nice, clean conclusions. You've got certainty. You've got these carefully detailed borders. But with ethics, it tends to be blurrier. Nonetheless, I think because there's not ever been a civilization that considers cowardice praiseworthy, then we can work with the prima facie hypothesis that cowardice is a vice. There we go. What can we build from that? If cowardice is a vice, and we can after the fact find reasons to consider it a vice, then we've got the beginnings of a support for it. We're probably not going to get the logical certainty that somebody may want, but this is ethics. It's not logic. We can say human life is special in some sense to where we should protect human life. I at least consider it a useful principle because I have a human life that I want protected. And I assume you would consider it a useful principle. But I would consider it also valuable with people that don't really contribute a lot to society, people I have no relation to. And if I consider that to be the case, and a lot of people agree with me, on their own independent bases, and they have their reasons just like I've got my reasons, then just treating it with some degree of fairness, there's a lot of reasons to think human life should generally be protected, even if we can grant that there's exceptions where a person has sacrificed their right to live. I could grant that in a military context, or someone's a threat to my life. I have self-defense. I grant that. But I think we have a working body of knowledge that we would call moral knowledge that includes things like cowardice is shameful, human life is special, and we should be treated broadly equal. I don't think that is a untenable starting point for our moral calculations.
But if we're starting to talk about things moral questions in terms of societies, then there's a lot of moral qualities or moral values that we can come up with without appealing to a objective source or a transcendent source of those values. Are we losing audio?
I
No, I
can't think
hear
of
you.
one example of what you're talking about. Could you offer one so I can see where you're
So
thinking of this?
civilizations across the world have made murder illegal, or
Okay.
frowned upon, discouraged, however you want to put it. I think it's better for society. I mean, it's objectively better for society if people are not running around in fear of getting murdered all the time.
Presuming that society is itself a worthwhile goal.
Well,
Civilization is a worthwhile goal.
Well, I'm not saying civilization is the goal. I'm saying that
A goal.
civilizations that exist and succeed and prosper and grow have figured out that making murder illegal is a good way to make that happen. And
Okay, so a general ban on murder is descriptively useful for the proliferation and survival of a society. I grant that. You haven't told me how that descriptive tenet is morally weighted. It's pragmatically weighted,
Right.
sure. It helps them towards that goal, but you haven't shown that goal is something worth aiming for. I want it to happen, but that want could be truthless, could be
every living thing on the planet, flora and fauna, have a survival mechanism. Otherwise, that species would go extinct. If we base it just on our basal survival instinct, probably the entire gambit of things have been tried in the past, and the things that don't work have ended in extinction. What does work is working together as a group, colonies, societies, forming eventually. And atheists like us, we don't see a huge distinction between us and any other life form on Earth. We all come from it, there's a common ancestor. What makes us different is our prefrontal cortex and our ability to plan ahead and use tools, and we're aware of our immortality. It doesn't go much beyond that. We have the same survival mechanism as any other animal. I think it's maybe if we base it on that, I don't know, can you call that a moral basis?
So
based on
survive?
Well,
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm not proposing my own objective morality. Objective morality.
Yeah, you're relativist or subjectivist or conventionalist or something in those lines, right?
Right. So I mean, I'm not saying that these are the rules necessarily that society should operate under for any reason. I'm very glad they do, because I do not want to get murdered, and I have empathy for my friends and family and do not want them to get murdered.
Thank you.
And you can do that with a lot of things like theft and perjury, and you would even add cowardice. You could say that cowardice is bad for society because cowards do not defend that society very well.
They are, you might say, descriptively bad relative to the goal of a flourishing, surviving society.
Right.
But prescriptive is saying that the goal is something that should be aimed for, and this helps us achieve that. But it hasn't been shown anywhere in naturalism that I know of that we should survive, that we should be happy.
Right, and I'm not saying right, and I'm not saying these are prescribed upon society by some greater source. They are self-imposed values or restrictions. And to say that there's anything more than that going on here, that's why I'd be interested to see people like Turek and Geisler, who claim that such a thing exists, to make a better case for it than we all just feel like it does.
Chris, I have so many notes on chapter 11 about the criterion of embarrassment. You touched on a couple already. We're already at the 2-hour mark. Maybe we could. I'm going to table that one. I don't want to take advantage of John's time. We've already taken 2 hours of his life away.
My wife's waiting for me to come to bed.
See, there we go.
And keep you in that case, but
that would be.
I know you're hosting this, but
prescriptively bad.
I just we would like to put your plugs and Jim Major's plugs, any links to anything that you're working on in our description section. So I'm not hosting this. Chris is. In fact, I'm going to bow out. Thank you so much. And we had some problems in the live feed. The pre-recorded will be back up on as soon as we can get it figured out, though.
Well,
Take
thanks
care.
for inviting me. very
Yeah.
serendipitous to
Great.
become a part of this.
Yeah,
See
Would
you
have
all
been a bunch
later.
of atheists just tearing up on the book.
Yeah, super. Yeah, we're very glad to have you. Like I said,
Great.
we can have our little atheist get-togethers if you want to complain about Christian stuff all the time. But this is all originally started with our atheist Christian book club,
Yeah.
which was why we read the book in the first place, and we were
Yeah.
ideally going to have Frank in our thing, but obviously didn't work out. But we're glad. I enjoyed talking to you. Enjoyed getting to know your perspective a little bit. And
Yeah, it was fun, and I want to encourage you, saying you seem very committed to being academically dispassionate, being fair, being thoughtful and thorough, and that effort to try to suspend biases and be as fair and intellectually rigorous as you can. That's commendable, and it's hard to come by lately. So keep working hard at it, keep digging at it, and I hope you find all the answers you're looking for, and maybe you can challenge some Christians to think a little clearer and know why they believe what they believe, even if you and I are on different sides of the tracks here.
well, thanks. Yeah, we definitely like having more the civil type of conversation rather than
Yeah,
being at each other's throats and hopefully trying to understand each other a little
thank you.
better.
Yeah,
But hopefully, if our YouTube viewers are watching this right now, that means it recorded properly and we're able to get something out of this. So thank you guys for watching, and hopefully our next live show will be a lot smoother. But thanks, and we'll see you next time.
thank you. I'm signing out.